Hi, the following is an audiobook written by Lee Eddy. It's called The Weaving of Threads. This is just the first chapter in the entire book. I'm doing this mostly as a gift to him, but hopefully, if it piques your interest, then you'll go out and buy the book and read it for yourself. There may be an audiobook to follow in the future, but I haven't settled on that permanently. So feel free to listen to this. If you enjoy it, I'll include a link in the description on where you can buy the book. All right? We'll talk to you later. The Weaving of Threads, Book 1, by Lee Eddy. Chapter 1, The Twisting of Threads, Jerusalem, 18 BC. He smelled so bad. The stench was nearly visible, like a cloud hanging about him. His own nose had long ago lost the battle and quit working. No one would let him come in to bathe because of the oozing, stinking sores. Lazarus had a life to be pitied. His life hung on by the thread of the compassion of those who passed by him. But with the rank air about him, few came close enough to give any alms. Age and malnutrition took a toll on his legs. He leaned on a makeshift crutch to move a single step. Jerusalem afforded few places for him to find shelter, but he had to venture out to beg for food and water. He would cover himself as best he could with his rags as defense against the heat and the scorn of the people around him. On occasion, his rags would lay too long on one of the sores and would scab over, so when he moved, it would tear away, causing the sore to fester even more and ooze profusely. He tried to establish his own place of rest, but lepers would steal his meager shelter if he left them for any length of time. Fearful of contracting leprosy, he avoided them. At least his smell helped keep them away. Though Jewish scripture made a way for the poor in the land to have provision, his immobility made gleaning almost impossible. His entire family was gone. Unwise choices caused him to lose everything he owned. The rich got richer, and he got poorer. Life grew worse when the Romans occupied the land. He could no longer pay the Romans or even the Jewish taxes. Then he got sick, and his body seemed to turn against him. Now he was totally dependent on others. The one hope he still had, though, was his faith in the coming of the Messiah. When he came, he would bring a godly kingdom. Every day Lazarus would pray. He would recite psalms of praise. He had studied the scrolls when he was younger, keeping them in his heart and memory. Often these verses were his only comfort. If only he could come today, he would think. Then Israel would be a godly again. Lazarus was a young man when the Roman occupation began and Herod took his seat over Jerusalem. He had witnessed the beginning of the restoration of the temple and the aqueducts that had been built. Life in Jerusalem had adapted, changing as they had to, but the one unchangeable thing, at least not to Lazarus, was the promise of God to live among his people in his temple. Faith in Jehovah was the foundation of their lives. Even at that, fewer and fewer people watched and waited for the Messiah. Synagogue life continued. The temple was still the focal point of their well-respected spiritual lives. And political zealots and insurrectionists often made a stir, but few had faith in the coming king. Lazarus clung to his faith like a shield. It was all he had. He hadn't eaten for a couple of days. He was getting weaker. He had to get somewhere while he still could. Lord God, please help me today to eat. I thank you. Chapter 1, Part 2. Shimon wore a good tunic today. He was delivering the things he had made to his customers. Today was the day to deliver things to his richer clientele, so he had to look the part as one who served the upper class. Shimon was a weaver. He had built his business through all the difficult times Israel had been through. He was nearing 20 when the Romans came. He had already started business as a weaver. He had apprenticed since he was 12, taking over the shop years later when the owner was killed in a tragic accident at the port of Joppa as he received cargo off the ships from Tarsus. When Shimon took over, he built the business and took care of the widow who had been left behind. With his wife dying and 2 boys to raise, his diligence and fervor made the business flourish. Now in his late 60s, he gave more and more over to his older son to do the work, while he went out on deliveries and took in new orders. And this enabled him to be active and engaging. He spent much time at the synagogues poring over the scrolls and having in-depth discussions with the men, always under the strict eye of the rabbis. Shimon was considered to be one of the old guard. The new politics and movements of the zealots didn't interest him. He loved the purity of the scriptures and the Messiah they promised. He wanted everyone to walk in the ancient paths that brought peace to their souls. Everything else was just distractions to him. God had blessed Shimon. His business always saw a steady stream of clients. They made lines of cloth from simple wool for cheap clothing to flax linen for more expensive clothing. He contracted with dyers who would make the different colors for both thread and full cloth, and fullers who would bleach and boil the cloth until it was pure white. Some of his workers just made the simple things. Day in and day out, while he and his sons would work the higher-end cloth, weaving colors into stripes and patterns. Shimon was glad to get to the point where he could leave the shop and go out and mingle with more people. Shimon considered it an honor to bless people less fortunate. Once a week, he would go out with parcels of food and clothing. He couldn't get rid of poverty, but he could help. Some of the poor would recognize him as he went about town. He always smiled and spoke blessing on them. Most thought kindly about him, but they knew if they spent much time with him, conversation would turn political about the condition of Israel and the need to flow in the commandments. He made his way to the portion of Jerusalem where more affluent people lived, with packages bound up in twine. He carried beautiful light blue window coverings of fine linen, ordered by a rich man he had known for years. This customer was hard to please. Shimon hoped he'd have no problem today. He steeled himself for whatever negotiations would be necessary. "Oh Lord," he said, "bless me today. I need your help." Chapter 1, Part 3. Lachish surveyed his courtyard from a balcony on the second floor. He was smug and satisfied with himself and his surroundings. He knew he ruled this dominion with an unwavering hand like a personal kingdom. When he spoke, servants rushed to obey. He considered every transaction as if he were conquering an enemy, taking ground, building his realm. He wore silk, satins, and fine linens with embroidery that couldn't be made locally. Today it was a flowing purple outer robe with a yellow underrobe and red sash. He was most proud of his purple robe. It was extremely expensive and hard to obtain. He imported his clothing mostly from Greece and Egypt, with some things coming in from Rome. He had made his money dealing with the Romans. He knew how to cater to their needs. He could get large amounts of meat, wine, and meal for the garrison in Jerusalem. If they needed something, they sent word to Lachish. He learned Latin so he could appease them in their own tongue. He would deal and double deal with the locals, taking a large cut of the transaction. He had an excellent grip on Greek, which was still the language of commerce in most of the world where he worked. He was Jewish and was raised in Jerusalem where he learned to barter. His father was one who would supply things for Herod, but Lachish found that working with Romans was easier because the intrigue was simpler. Herod's court was a viper den of backstabbing, lying people jockeying for position. The Romans were simpler. You could see them coming a mile away. Everyone around Lachish considered him a traitor. They would still deal with him because he made them money, but he was not well liked, just tolerated as a necessary evil. Lachish didn't care what the people thought of him. They were just rabble, the everyday folk of Israel. Some, like him, who lived in opulence, extracted what they could, profiting off the misery that had become life for the Jews. For the most part, though, he lived in his own realm, self-satisfied and arrogant. Today he waited to do business with some of the lower-class people he had to deal with occasionally. They were bringing in cowhides to be taken to the tanner who would make leather for the Roman armor. The original armor came from Rome, but it had to be repaired locally. Most of his business was housed in a large building just outside of Jerusalem, but the negotiations of price and money exchange were conducted at his house. Lachish didn't trust people to handle his money. He preferred armed guards he paid very well to protect him. They would take him a couple of times a week out to the warehouse to make sure things ran smoothly. From where he stood in his villa, Lachish could watch the front entrance, opposite the courtyard. His guards were stationed in a room between the entrance of the courtyard and the front gate where they had a small desk for simple transaction and barred windows allowing them to see out onto the street. They were to screen and greet people who came. Lachish had determined the guards were to be obviously armed and dressed for action. One of the guards entered the courtyard, looked up, and bowed. "Lord Lachish," he said, "a couple of representatives from the son of Deber are here to see you." Lachish loved the power position on the balcony when people came. "Bring them in, Telem." Bowing again, Telem spun on his heel and went out quickly. Lachish remained there, to look imposing to greet his guests. Since he was somewhat shorter than the average man in Jerusalem, he used the height of the balcony to intimidate. He stuck both thumbs into the top of his red satin sash. He cocked his head back to appear to be looking down on them even further, his eyes looking out from under his folds of eyelids, sighting down his large hooked nose. His obese face was framed with a sparse beard closely trimmed. His cap covered his balding head and the huge purple robe flowed around him. He thought he looked majestic. Telem ushered two men into the courtyard, then turned and stood by the entrance, watching them closely. Both men came in and looked around at the very costly furnishings. Eventually they looked up and spotted Lachish standing over them. The two of them smiled broadly. "Greetings to you, sir. Are you Master Lachish?" "I am," he said. "And you are?" "I am Uthaya, and this is my son Peretz, of the sons of Deber. We are bringing the hides as you requested." Both the men wore the common dress for the men of Israel, a short woolen tunic held at the waist with leather strappings.
Their heads were covered in the common keffeya, a shoulder-length headcloth. The older man was more filled out, muscular, and work-hardened. The younger man, Peretz, was a bit taller, but quite a bit thinner, and held a hide folded into a compact bundle. Lachish started a deliberate, slow walk to his left, heading for the top of the staircase that took the entire side of the courtyard. He methodically took each stair down into the courtyard, holding the rail with a hand loaded with rings. He did most of this for show, aiding the manipulation of negotiations. As he reached the bottom, Abez, the second guard, came in from the entrance. "Shimon the Weaver is here to see you, master." Lachish took this information in stride. "Show him in," he said. Lachish was pleased to hear this timing and smiled to himself. He knew if there was another watching, he could twist the deal as the first ones in wouldn't want to act shamefully. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and waited. Abez ushered Shimon into the courtyard, turned, and stood by Telem. Shimon saw he wasn't there alone and humbly turned off to the left to stand patiently to the side. Lachish took advantage of the theatrics and walked purposefully until he stood before Uthaya. "What have you brought me?" he asked. "This is a sample of what we brought to you from 40 such hides." With that, Peretz handed Lachish the folded hide he had been holding. Lachish took it by its edges, as if he didn't want his hands to get dirty, and let it unfold. He looked down his nose at it as he frowned with a scowl between his eyes. "This is quite thin," he said. "The tanning process will make it even thinner. I need better hides than this. What are you asking for them?" "A denarius apiece," Uthaya offered. Lachish's face darkened with mock anger. "For this?" He held it up higher in front of Uthaya. "You must want to make me a target of mockery." "Lachish will pay anything," he said sarcastically. "Don't be ridiculous. These hides are not thin. A denarius apiece is close to the cost it takes to make and bring them here. We need that. Maybe you should take them straight to the tanner. Maybe he will pay you that." "We tried. He said he wouldn't take any except they come from you." "Then I suggest you take my price or else you will get nothing for them. I will give you 20 denarii. 20? Said Uthaya. "I can't feed my family on 20. At least give me 30. Uthaya's voice showed desperation. He really needed this to go through. Lachish heard his tone. That was his signal he had won, and had the upper hand. 25. That is all I will pay. Or take them to someone else." "There is no one else." Uthaya reached out and grabbed Lachish by the arm. Lachish glared at him. Immediately, Telem leapt in and seized Uthaya's upper arm with an iron grip. Uthaya looked at Telem, shocked and scared, and instantly released Lachish, pulling his own arm back as if he had touched acid. "Please, I meant no disrespect. I need that money." His eyes returned to Lachish, pleading, looking for some break in the wall Lachish presented. Lachish glanced at Shimon, who was watching this all unfold. Acting as if he were doing something highly honorable, Lachish quietly said, "I'll give you 28 for the lot." Then he spoke to Telem. "Pay him and get his mark on the tablet." He dismissed the men with a flick of his wrist, and turned towards Shimon as if they were no longer there. Uthaya and Peretz stood stunned, looking at each other, trying to figure out how they had lost all that money so easily. "But—" Uthaya tried to speak more, but Telem used his grip to turn Uthaya around and usher him toward the door. The two men stumbled and shuffled forward, finally finding themselves in the guard room. Telem counted out 28 denarii from a leather purse hanging from his belt, then held out a quill and a tablet for them to mark on. He stared at them like a rock statue until Uthaya reached out and took the quill, hesitantly reaching out to make his mark next to his name. Telem handed him the coins. "Thank you. Peace be with you." With that, Telem stepped back into the gate and closed it, leaving them standing in the street with their mouths gaping. Chapter 1, Part 4. Lachish moved over to where Shimon stood and bowed condescendingly. "Welcome to my house. I see you have my curtains." Shimon had just witnessed the vanquishing of the two Jewish men and didn't know exactly how to respond. "Yes, I do," he said. "They turned out even better than I had hoped. The dye is exceptionally consistent." As they were presented to him, Lachish almost tenderly received them. "Oh, they are quite beautiful." He took the top one, untying the knot in the twine. He released the pressure and let the cloth respond to his touch. As they stood there, Abez picked up the hide from the floor where it had been dropped, refolded it carefully, and took it out front. It was as if the other transaction hadn't even happened. The cloth had unfurled, cascading over the floor between the two men. "Exquisite. How much do I owe you?" "I had told you before that it would cost 60 denarii. That is all I ask." "Then that is what you shall receive. This is totally worth it. How wonderful they will look in my forward receiving room." Lachish snapped for his house servants who were close and ready. 3 young men dressed in simple white tunics appeared, coming quickly to stand in line just to Lachish's right. One took the rest of the bundles from Shimon while the others retrieved the loose cloth, folding it gently. "Take this up to the stewards," Lachish said. "They are to be installed today." With obvious nods of obedience, they stepped quickly. "And bring wine," he shouted. With a graceful swing of his hand, Lachish motioned toward one of the doors under the balcony. Shimon knew he was being asked in, but he also knew it wasn't just a request. With a simple bow of reception, he walked toward the door, which seemed to open on its own. As he stepped just inside the door, he was invited to sit on a stool by the door as the servant knelt and pulled close a basin of water. With smooth dexterity, he loosened Shimon's sandals and proceeded to wash his feet and dry them off with a towel that hung on the end of the stool Shimon now occupied. After wiping down the sandals from the dust on them, he replaced them, tightening the ties expertly. He had done this all without looking up to see Shimon's face. He finally stood, bowing slightly, motioning to enter the room. Lachish stood close, taking pride in the efficiency of his staff whom he had trained. His pride wasn't about them, it was about how it made him look that was important. One of the servants entered with a pitcher and glasses on a tray. In the room there were several large pillows surrounding a short table in the middle. Lamps burnt all around, casting a dim yellow glow. Easing onto one of the pillows, Shimon deftly removed his keffiyeh and stretched out on his side. The servant poured a glass half full of wine and placed it in front of him. Lachish had walked around him and, gathering up folds of the purple robe, plopped unceremoniously on a pillow close to Shimon's head. The servants moved around them and placed a glass full of wine close to him. Bowls were placed within reach with figs, grapes, and small cakes. The servants then quietly backed up to the walls and tried to merge into them. "Bring me 60 denarii from Telem," Lachish commanded the servant closest to the door. "Thank you for paying promptly," Shimon began. "Why wouldn't I? I value what you've made." "Well, I was concerned with how you paid those men before." The look on Lachish's face changed. His eyes narrowed and his smile turned from culturally pleasant to nearly a smirk. That was business. They needed to be put in place so they know who is in charge. They are new suppliers to me. I established the way negotiations were to be done. What you made for me is personal. I want what I want, and I will surround myself with the pleasures of life. However, I will determine the price I pay for the goods. They will learn. It will be better. You don't like that? "I don't mean to offend," said Shimon. "I don't want to tell you how to do your business. Those are men of Israel. I feel we have the responsibility to treat men of Israel differently than we treat those who don't know our God." Lachish just stared at Shimon. He had reached out and took his wine. He emptied it by a third before he placed it back on the table. "I don't need anyone telling me how to live. I will treat anyone in any way I desire. I like my comfort. I like my wine. I like my money. I do fine without doing it by the scrolls." Putting a hand to his chest and bowing his head, Shimon said with sincerity, "Please forgive me. Again, it isn't my place to tell you how to do anything. I try to live my life as close to the scrolls as I can, and it always catches me by surprise when differences are exposed. I beg your pardon for my boldness." "Granted. I didn't want anything to come between us. There are other things I wish for you to make." Shimon saw the arrogance, but didn't respond with sadness he felt. He smiled slightly and bowed his head. The condition of Israel concerned him greatly, but so few were open to the message. Lachish downed another third of his glass, thinking he had won another victory. It was worth celebrating. But, then again, he didn't need much of an excuse to drink. "Please, try the cakes. They are delicious." Lachish took a couple of the cakes and devoured them, washing them down with a glug from his glass. Opulence served him well. After eating one of the cakes and having a few sips of the wine, Shimon felt he had satisfied social demands. "Thank you for your hospitality, but I need to continue on my rounds." Lachish closed his eyes and nodded, giving Shimon the permission to leave. Shimon stood, collecting his keffiyeh. Bowing with his hand on his heart, one of the servants handed Shimon his payment. He nodded to the servants, receiving the pouch. "May the shalom of God be on you and your house." Lachish just nodded to him. Shimon turned and strode through the door into the courtyard. He tucked the pouch into his sash, and then placed and adjusted his keffiyeh for outdoor travel. As he passed into the guardroom, Telem was there with the tablet and quill. After signing, the gate was opened, and Shimon stepped out onto the streets of Jerusalem. Chapter 1, Part 5. Lazarus was in great pain. He had made it part of the way to the temple area and felt something snap in his lower leg. His foot wasn't supposed to be at that angle, was it? He sat there on the side of the street, trying to catch his breath. How was he going to be able to beg if he couldn't get to where people were walking by? He saw a couple of men walking in his direction. As they got closer, he hoped to be able to get a couple lepta from them. Even if he did, how was he going to be able to get somewhere to buy something to eat? Sweat poured off his head from the pain throbbing in his leg. "O Lord God," he said, "please help me." Uthaya and Peretz were walking slowly, trying to figure out how they were going to tell the family about not getting enough money, being swindled by a rich man hurt. Uthaya grew angrier as he walked. Even as he walked, lost in thought, something broke through to his consciousness. What was that smell? Looking down a little way ahead of him was a beggar. Lazarus looked up at them imploringly. "Alms, please." He stretched out one hand and supported himself with the other. "Please, sir, I am so hungry." Uthaya stopped just to stare at the man. Peretz looked at Uthaya with sadness in his eyes. "What can we do?" he asked. "We don't have anything to give you. We have just been in a deal that took away everything that we had." "Isn't there something you can help me with?" Uthaya looked over him, cringing at the sores and dirt. Lazarus suddenly winced and cried out a little. Peretz pointed to his right foot. "Look, his leg is twisted." "It just happened," said Lazarus. "I can't move. Can you help me?" Taking off his bag, Uthaya looked inside, pulling out a small thin blanket. Taking it out, he started to tear one edge, ripping a strip from one whole length. He then took the strip and wrapped the foot and ankle, stabilizing it. Every few moments, he wiped his watering eyes from the smell. He tried to breathe through his mouth, hoping it would help him not encounter the odor. Peretz gave Lazarus some gulps of water from his wineskin, Lazarus downing it greedily. Uthaya finished, wrapping it with a knot that would hold for a while, then rocked back on his heels as he examined his work. Looking up, he made eye contact with Peretz. Peretz was truly concerned, as was his way. Looking at Peretz, Uthaya knew they weren't going to leave this man. Peretz wouldn't let them leave him. Looking at Peretz, Uthaya said, "Come over here. We need to talk for a minute." He stood and walked back up the street a few steps, trying to catch some fresh air. "I have an idea to help this man. Can you stand the smell for a little while longer?" Peretz nodded at him. "Good. Let's take him back to the house of Lachish and set him at the back door of his villa. They will be able to give him food and drink. They have plenty. Does that sound good to you?" Peretz's face lit up in a smile. "That would do it. They could help better than anything we could do," he replied. "We'll use the blanket to carry him so we don't have to touch him and his sores. Afterward, he can keep it. What do you say?" Peretz nodded enthusiastically in agreement. Uthaya took several deep breaths to clear his sinuses and went back to Lazarus. "We know a place where you can go," he said. "They will be able to feed you and care for you. Is that all right with you?" That was the best offer Lazarus had had in a long time. "Thank you. That would be wonderful. Jehovah be praised." Uthaya, putting his bag back over his shoulder, spread the blanket beside Lazarus with Peretz's help. "You will have to try to move over to the blanket." Lazarus wiggled over, trying not to hurt his ankle. He finally got situated, holding his crutch close to his chest. Uthaya knelt behind his head and reached down, putting his arms behind Lazarus's shoulders, grabbing the blanket on both sides with his upper back, touching nothing but blanket and cradling Lazarus's head on his chest. Peretz took the two lower corners, twisted them into handles, pulled them to the sides of Lazarus's knees, and started to lift as Uthaya pulled him up off the ground. Walking mostly sideways, they proceeded to go back up the hill towards Lachish's villa. Carrying him required extremely close contact with Lazarus's body, being directly under Uthaya's nose. It was very difficult to get a full breath. Chapter 1, Part 6. Consumed in thought, Shimon left the villa with a heavy heart. This was indicative of the condition of Israel. People were too busy trying to gain wealth or accolades to look at their lives before the Lord God. He knew he had to act like a businessman to get the accounts he needed, but how he wished he could do business with people who loved God. He knew men like Lachish, who were eaten up by greed, food, and wine. It didn't turn out well for them, but that didn't seem to matter. There was more to life than just living it here, he was sure of it. "We need to open our eyes," he thought out loud. Something caught his attention. He looked up to see a strange sight. Two men were carrying a third on a blanket up the hill. He suddenly recognized the two who were doing the carrying as the men who had just been at Lachish's house conducting business and not faring well. As they got closer, the smell hit him. He had known that smell before. When he did his rounds bringing food and clothing to people, he had run across it, full of curiosity. He walked toward them. "Greetings. Do you need some help here?" The younger man was having trouble keeping his grip. Shimon stepped in and grabbed the closest corner, allowing the man to get a better grip with both hands on the other side. "What are you men doing?" "We are taking this man to the servants' entrance of Lachish's house. They will be able to feed him there." Uthaya barely spoke out under the strain of his load. Shimon let the years of moving the shuttle bring in his strength as he helped share the weight. Now they were walking with Peretz and Shimon in front, and Uthaya bringing up the rear. This was much easier, and they were able to move much quicker. As they walked, Shimon had to get used to the stench quickly as he noticed the sores on the wrapped ankle. When he couldn't afford it, he turned to look at the man they were carrying. "I know you. Aren't you Lazarus? I've given you food before." Lazarus's face was filled with concern and fatigue. Even though he was being carried, it was hard for him to hold himself in place, and the pain of his foot was getting through to him. "Yes, I know you. You have been kind to me." When they arrived at the villa, they went down a little alley to the servants' entrance where the business of the household was done. It was a stone enclosure that made room for entering the house and shuffling merchandise. A couple of stray, ragged dogs who had known this place as the source of scraps were startled, ran away a short distance, and then stopped to watch. Turning around with Uthaya backing up, they found a place close to the corner, a short distance from the stairs, to lay Lazarus so he would be out of the way but comfortable. Uthaya stepped back, stretching his back from carrying the load. Perret stood up and shook out his hands from gripping for so long. Shimon rested with both hands on his knees, breathing a little heavy, and asked Lazarus, "Are you all right?" Sitting up with his back against the wall, Lazarus winced at the pain of his ankle. "I will be much better now." "Is there anything I can get you?" Shimon asked as he stood up. "No, you have done so much." Lazarus looked around at the men. "Thank you so much. Your concern has moved me greatly." Uthaya looked at him and said, "You will be safe here. They should be able to bring you something. We need to go, but you should be fine." With that, he motioned to Perez that they should leave. "Don't forget the blanket," Lazarus said with humble gratitude. "Please, you keep it. You need it more than we do." Uthaya was glad not to have to touch it again. Peretz only saw it as kindness. He felt good that they had helped this man. "Can we leave him the water skin too?" Peretz asked. Uthaya knew the heart of his son. He also knew he didn't want to drink from it after Lazarus. "Most certainly, we can make another one. Blessings on you all. We must leave now." "Blessings on your way," Shimon said as he smiled graciously at them. The look on Lazarus's face said everything to them. They were off down the street. "Thank you for doing that, Abba," Peretz said to his father. He felt a lot better than he had after their meeting with Lachish. To him, this made the trip worthwhile. Uthaya, on the other hand, looked like he was doing the right thing, but what was in his heart was a lot darker. He had done this to place the horrible smell just outside Lachish's house in an attitude of vengeance. His suffering through the smell was justified with the satisfaction of getting back at Lachish. Both men walked with the step of one who had done something personally rewarding. One of them was correct. Shimon was concerned for Lazarus. "Will you be all right here? Do you want me to bring you anything?" "No, please, you have done enough. It is true I should be able to do well from the scraps coming from this big house. I have seen it before. I will be fine. The Lord God has blessed me this day, and I am grateful. Then I will leave you to get rest. May God richly bless you." With that, Shimon bowed to Lazarus, and turning also departed. Lazarus felt truly blessed. He had a place that could give him sustenance, and he now had a blanket and a water skin. He closed his eyes and recited some psalms of praise. It almost made up for the pain in his ankle. Chapter 1, Part 7. Lachish had several more transactions that day. Each one was celebrated with more wine and food. He received reports from his couriers about activities at the warehouse. By evening, he was inebriated by it all. He couldn't walk by himself. His wife checked on him periodically, wondering if he was going to be in any condition to join the family for the evening meal. Most days he wasn't. Today was no different. She came to his office after the last customer had left. They had lit the evening lamp, and she saw him sprawled below the low, thin table used as a desk, propped up by pillows. She came up beside him, kneeling down, and put her arm around his shoulders. He turned his head to her, yet his neck didn't seem to have the strength or control to keep his head steady. Trying to focus on her, he slurred, "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to help you come upstairs." She held him from behind, nudging him to stand up. Getting him off the pillows was hard, and it was a long way up. She had to help him negotiate getting out from behind the desk. His bulk made things more difficult. She couldn't lift him, only encourage him with firm pressure which way to go. She called on a couple of servants to come to help navigate him. He kept muttering about how important he was, and how he had won so many victories today. She kept replying in a low voice, "Yes, you are. I'm sure that is true. You have done well today. But now it is time to come upstairs." All this was a fairly consistent nightly ritual. The wine was clearly in control. The family lived on the second level. Business was conducted downstairs. He liked that the second level had better breezes coming through, keeping it quite cool. His life was one of increased wealth, but decreasing satisfaction. There wasn't enough for him. He needed more food, more wine, more furnishing, more expensive clothing. He lived in comfort in everything but his soul. Now, again, he was being deposited on his bed like a lump. He had no idea what most people thought of him, be it hate, pity, disgust, or ridicule. His wife was patient. She took care of him, trying to stay in the background. She tried to give him no cause to focus any of his anger at her or the children. They lived quietly and insulated from him. To him, they were just more things he owned. He had no concern for them and no part in the function of the family. He didn't have to do anything. That was why he paid the servants. His world revolved only around him. It was his only focus. Chapter 1, Part 8. The next morning, Lachish woke up late and slow. He didn't remember how he got into his sleeping tunic. He knew his head hurt and his stomach felt queasy. He walked clumsily out from the bedchamber into the family area. Abigail sat with their children. She was as educated as a woman could be and had taught the children how to read and count. Shemuel had gone to school and was getting close to his bar mitzvah. He soon would take his place as an apprentice at the warehouse. Lachish could afford to support their family for generations, but it was his plan to have Shemuel take the legacy of the business, like his father. Penaniah was becoming a young woman much faster than Lachish wanted. It wouldn't be long before they would arrange a marriage for her, probably with one of the rich families around them. It would be acceptable to Lachish if she married a Roman. He had no dear ties with Israel, but his children were raised to know the culture and traditions, giving them a future no matter which path they took. Midday meal was being prepared. They were waiting and prepared to eat. Lachish came in and joined them. It was apparent he wasn't feeling well. They were used to that, and knew to give him a quiet berth. He lowered himself into a cushioned chair carefully. Movement was painful. He looked at his son, and something didn't seem right. Shemuel winced almost as badly as he did. Then he noticed they all were scrunching their noses or reacting in some way. As his senses awakened from his stupor, he started noticing something creeping into his awareness. Then he sniffed. What is that smell? Lachish got up, trying to track its source. He started walking toward the kitchen where food preparation was going on. The servants were startled seeing him come in. He never came in. Where is that smell coming from? He demanded. The head servant just pointed out the door leading outside. Lachish knew his curiosity might not be a good idea this time, but he couldn't help wanting to know. He went out the door and down the stairs when he finally got a full look at Lazarus laying there. Lazarus was eating a few scraps of food that had been thrown to him. He looked up and the two men locked eyes. The sight Lachish saw revolted him. With the pounding of his head and his already nauseous stomach, he wasn't feeling well at all. The open sores were very obvious, and the wrapped foot meant the lack of mobility. Where did you come from? Lachish now needed to know what was happening just outside his back door. Some kind people placed me here to give me some shelter and supply. Thank you, kind master, for the place and the scraps. I am very grateful. Lazarus knew his predicament was totally dependent on the mercy of the lord of the house. You reek! The stench fills my house! You can't stay here. Sir, I am wounded and cannot move. Have mercy for a little while until the pain goes down some. I will move on as soon as I can. Something has to be done. This is unacceptable, said Lachish. I am sorry, my lord, but no one will allow me to come get clean. May I come in and wash? No, certainly not. I don't want your stench in my house. Lachish was horrified thinking of this creature inside his fabulous dwelling. Please, sir, I need something. Lazarus's eyes were pleading with a desperate intensity. I will do something, that's for sure. Looking back up the stairs, Lachish began to yell, Bring me a bucket of water. Bring it now. A servant appeared at the top of the stairs with a pail of dirty water from preparing food. He quickly came down the stairs and handed it to Lachish. Lachish turned and threw the water full force on the man below him. The water took Lazarus's breath away, shocking his system. He jerked strongly in reaction to the sudden cold and banged his foot on the hard dirt, causing a spasm of pain to shoot up his leg. The pain made Lazarus pull back violently. He hit his head on the stone wall, cracking open a small wound on the back of his head. He pulled his head slowly forward, leaving the blood stain on the wall. His body was chilled, his leg throbbed, and now his head hurt. He put his hand on the back of his head, pulling away a bloody palm. As the pain subsided some, he looked up at Lachish, who was stunned at the developments. Lachish didn't know what to do next. He caught some movement at the top of the stairs and glanced up. He saw Shemuel watching him. Now he felt trapped in what to do. You can stay here for a while, but I will do something about that smell. Turning to the servant, he ordered, If you smell him again, hit him with another bucket of water. I don't want to smell him again. Understand me? The servant nodded in obedience and fear. Turning his attention to Lazarus again, all he could do was look at the man. Something about his face captured Lachish's attention. The humility in Lazarus's eyes was a strength Lachish didn't understand. How could he be like that in this condition? There wasn't any bitterness or anger. With everything that was happening, he was still grateful. It bothered Lachish. Something shook him to his core. He shoved the bucket into the chest of the servant, making him grab it. With another glance at Lazarus and nearly gagging, he mounted the stairs shakily. The servant looked at Lazarus with an expression of apology, but he knew he was going to have to douse him with water again pretty soon. Lazarus knew it also. He just nodded with a knowing look that released the servant from any culpability. They knew where they stood. The servant left Lazarus to himself. Alone again, Lazarus surveyed his situation. He was wet. He would dry pretty quickly since it was nearly midday. He laid on his new blanket, which was also wet. He pulled it out from underneath him with considerable effort and wriggling. Now it would dry better. He used the corner of the blanket to clean his head wound and wipe his body down some. That may help the smell a little. The bandage on his foot was wet, and the cold water relieved some of the pain. His water skin had been filled earlier by the servants who had found him and had given him some food they were going to throw away anyway. They didn't want to give him good food, for fear of the master of the house. They only would give him scraps. All in all, he was better off than he had been for a while, except for his ankle. The tallying of the situation brought him to praise the Lord God again. Lord, I am grateful for all you have brought me today. Please help me be wise. All that had just happened had weakened him. He laid down flat on his back and passed into a calm sleep. Sleep felt good. He hadn't had much deep sleep for a while. Pain had kept him awake, but now he slipped into a solid slumber. He woke up feeling something very strange happening to him. He opened his eyes to see a couple of dogs. One of them licked the sores on his leg. It felt good, like it was cleaning it out. The other dog cautiously approached from the other side, starting to lick some of the sores on his upper arm. For some reason, it felt like they were companions on the same journey. He was thankful for the company. He talked to them in a calm, friendly voice. They soon lost interest and loped down the road. Lazarus felt the loss of their company. The loneliness crowded in. Chapter 1, Part 9. As he dried out, the smell started coming back. With the reprieve from the smell for a period, the return affected him. He knew if there was an odor now, there would be a return of the bucket. Mid-afternoon, there was a stream of activity as people came bringing supplies for the household. Things were brought in and out. For the most part, he was ignored, but as the stench started returning, the people noticed him more and more. He knew it was only a matter of time. Closer to sundown, a servant came back out. He had the bucket with him, but he also had a small bundle wrapped in a cloth. He came down the stairs, trying not to look Lazarus in the face. He set the bundle aside and, as he was instructed, he threw the contents on Lazarus. Lazarus had tried to keep the blanket dry, but it didn't work very well. The servant picked up the bundle, coming close to Lazarus. He knelt down, handing him the bundle as he said softly, "I am so sorry. I don't have a choice. I hope this makes up for it some. Bless you. You are a good man and a good servant. May God bless you and your household." Opening the package, Lazarus found some bread smeared with oil, a small dried fish, and a few figs. His mouth and eyes went wide with wonder and gratitude. "Thank you so much. You have blessed me beyond measure today." The servant stood, retrieved his bucket, and with a sad smile climbed the stairs, leaving Lazarus on his own again. He ate his meal, feeling like it was a feast. It felt wonderful to have something inside him again, and the taste was grand. With a few drinks from the water skin, his meal was complete. The sun was completely down now. Lazarus tried to wrap himself in the blanket as the breeze picked up. He eventually went to sleep, waking up every so often, shivering and in pain.